At South Ridge Correctional Facility in Georgia, 34-year-old Terrance Whitaker had already served 7 years of a 15-year sentence for armed robbery and aggravated assault. Tall, heavily built, with inked forearms and eyes that rarely softened, Terrance carried himself like a man with nothing left to lose. Inside prison walls, vulnerability meant weakness, and weakness meant danger. But beneath that hardened shell was a man slowly drowning in silence and regret. He had no one left. His mother died 2 years into his sentence. His father, a man who'd been more of a ghost than a parent, never once visited. His sister had written twice. Both letters ended with the words, "I can't do this anymore." So, Terrance did what many inmates eventually do. He reached out to the outside world, hoping for a connection. Someone, anyone, who might see the human behind the number stitched onto his uniform. That's how it started. A casual flyer passed out by a correctional officer promoting a pen pal program for inmates. Terrance filled it out half-heartedly, not expecting much. A few weeks later, a letter arrived, written in neat cursive on pink stationery. It smelled faintly of lavender. The sender, Nina Love, age 28, from Savannah, Georgia. Her first letter was gentle, simple, and curious. "I don't know your story, but I believe everyone deserves someone to talk to. If you'd like to write back, I'd be honored to listen." Terrance stared at the words longer than he should have. It wasn't the letter itself that gripped him. It was the tone. There was no judgment in it. No pity. Just a woman offering her time to a stranger behind bars. He wrote back, and she responded. And soon, what began as brief, spaced-out letters turned into full pages exchanged weekly, then almost daily. Nina shared little details about her life. She worked remotely in graphic design, loved painting, and lived alone with 2 cats named Storm and Thunder. She joked about the irony of their names not matching their quiet personalities. She confessed to a failed engagement and a few years of therapy. Terrance told her things he hadn't told anyone. About the night of the robbery, the friend who bailed and left him take the fall, the guilt he carried, and the sleepless nights filled with what-ifs. But it wasn't just therapy for him. It was awakening. Nina had a way of pulling the truth from him without demanding it. Her words fell like sunlight through the cracks in his cold, gray world. She wasn't like the women he'd known before, loud, chaotic, and transactional. Nina was quiet strength, emotional intelligence, empathy wrapped in softness. And most of all, she saw him, not the convict, not the criminal, but the boy who'd grown up hungry, scared, and angry. Photos followed. The first one, Nina smiling by the ocean, oversized sunglasses hiding most of her face, curly dark hair whipping in the wind. She wore a flowy sundress and a necklace that read "Free." The irony didn't escape him. Terrance stared at that photo until the edges wore thin. She was beautiful, not model perfect, but elegant, feminine, intoxicating. His cellmate joked, "She too pretty to be riding your ugly ass." Terrance just smirked and tucked the photo under his pillow where it stayed. After 7 months of correspondence, Nina scheduled her first visit. Terrance almost didn't go. Something about seeing her in person terrified him. What if she saw him, really saw him, and changed her mind? What if this whole thing was a game to her? But the moment she walked into the visitation room, everything he feared melted. She was shorter than he expected, wearing jeans and a simple blouse. Her hair was pulled into a low bun. No makeup, no flash, just Nina, raw and real. And yet, her eyes lit up like she'd waited her whole life for this moment. When she smiled, he felt in his chest. They talked for an hour. Then 2. By the end of the visit, when she leaned forward and gently took his hand across the table, his throat tightened. It had been so long since someone touched him without violence, without demand. Her fingers were small, warm. No words were exchanged in that moment, but everything was understood. The visits became regular. Twice a month at first, then every week. Guard began to whisper. Some were amused, others annoyed. But no one could deny there was something different about the way Terrance carried himself now. He walked straighter, talked softer, started reading again. One officer said to another, "Love must be a hell of a drug." They weren't wrong. 9 months after that first visit, Terrance proposed during visitation. He didn't have a ring, just a handmade bracelet he'd braided from threads pulled from a prison bedsheet. He'd carved her name into a tiny heart-shaped piece of soap. Nina said yes with tears in her eyes. The prison chaplain officiated the ceremony 2 weeks later. It was modest, quiet. No guests. Just them, a ring Nina brought from outside, and 2 COs who signed as witnesses. Terrance became a married man, and for the first time in years, he felt human again. But even fairy tales forged in darkness have their cracks. Nina avoided talking about her past. Anytime Terrance asked about her family, she'd shut down, said they were complicated, said they wouldn't approve. He didn't push. Everyone had pain. Everyone had shadows. Besides, who was he to judge? What he didn't know, what she never said, was that the secret Nina carried could rip their fragile world to shreds. That love, as healing as it was, had been built on a foundation of omission, a truth so vital, so explosive. It was only a matter of time before it surfaced, with devastating consequences. And when it did, love would turn to rage, trust would ignite into murder, and Terrance Whitaker's new life, the one he built on hope, would come crashing down in the most violent way imaginable. In the weeks following their prison wedding, everything seemed almost too good to be true. Terrance had never felt anything like this before. Not on the streets, not in the game, not even in his youth when he still believed in love. Nina had awakened something tender in him, something soft and sacred. For the first time in years, the cold cement walls of South Ridge didn't feel quite so suffocating. His mind was no longer consumed by anger or regret. He had a wife now, a future, a reason to survive. But even as Terrance basked in his new reality, something wasn't quite right. Nina had changed, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice. But Terrance, he noticed everything. Her visits became more restrained. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. When he asked questions about her childhood, she'd redirect. When he brought up the idea of starting a life together after his release, getting a place, maybe having kids, she'd go quiet. And then came the first lie. It started small. Terrance had asked about her job. She'd always said she was a freelance graphic designer. He casually mentioned a design program he saw in a magazine and asked if she used it. Her answer was off. She called the software by the wrong name. At first, he brushed it off. Maybe she misspoke. Maybe he was being paranoid. But then came more inconsistencies. Stories that changed slightly each time she told them. An uncle who died in her childhood now suddenly became a family friend. A past job that lasted 2 years mysteriously shortened to a few months. None of it felt malicious, more like evasive. He tried to push the thoughts away. But suspicion, once it seeps in, doesn't leave quietly. One afternoon, while sitting on his bunk, Terrance mentioned Nina to a new inmate named Derek, a wiry man with tired eyes and a wicked sense of intuition. Derek listened, nodding slowly, then leaned in and asked, "Ever seen her birth certificate?" Terrance laughed it off. "Man, who the hell sees their wife's birth certificate?" Derek shrugged. "I'm just saying. Don't nobody just appear out of thin air, all perfect and sweet and wanting to marry a man behind bars, unless they running from something." It was a throwaway comment, but it hit like a bullet. From that moment, the seed of doubt began to grow, strangling every interaction. Terrance tried to ignore it. He didn't want to believe anything could be wrong. But something inside him refused to rest. A week later, Terrance received a letter, but it wasn't from Nina. It was from someone who had no return address. The envelope was plain, the handwriting shaky. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 4 words written in black ink. Ask her about Marcus. No context, no explanation. Just that. Terrance's heart pounded as he reread the message over and over. He didn't know anyone named Marcus. He'd never heard Nina mention that name. He tried to convince himself it was a prank, some inmate's twisted idea of fun. But something about it felt personal, real. The next visitation day, he couldn't keep the letter off his mind. Nina arrived wearing a soft yellow dress and a denim jacket. She smiled, kissed his cheek, but he didn't kiss her back. He stared at her, searching her face for answers she hadn't yet given. "Who's Marcus?" he asked. Her eyes flickered just for a second, but he saw it. Panic, recognition, fear. She tried to smile. "What are you talking about?" "I got a letter," he said. Ask her about Marcus." "So I'm a skin." She swallowed. Her hands trembled. "I don't know any Marcus." Lie. He could feel it in his bones. But he didn't press further, not then. He leaned back and watched her with a new lens. Every word she spoke, every nervous glance, every forced smile. The woman he loved was suddenly a stranger. Over the next few days, Terrance became obsessed. Every quiet hour in his cell was spent replaying conversations, analyzing letters, scrutinizing photos. He asked an inmate who worked in the mailroom to intercept Nina's letters before they were delivered. He read them in silence, looking for clues, trying to catch her slipping. Then it happened. One letter, dated 3 weeks earlier, ended with a strange line. "I wish I could just tell you the whole truth, but I'm scared I'll lose you forever." That was it. No context. No follow-up. The line haunted him. He began writing Nina more direct letters, demanding answers. Her responses came slower now, vague and hesitant. Something was unraveling, not just in their marriage, but inside Terrance's mind. He asked a favor from a CO he knew, a younger officer who owed him for helping keep the peace on the block. Terrance handed him Nina's full name, address, and $100 worth of commissary credit and whispered, "Find out who she really is." It took 6 days. When the officer returned, he didn't say a word, just slipped Terrance a printed sheet of paper before walking away. It was a background check. At the top, the legal name, Marcus D. Lovell. Born male. Transitioned at age 24. Terrance felt like the air had been sucked out of his lungs. He sat frozen on his bunk, staring at the name. Marcus. That damn name from the letter. The woman he married. The woman he'd trusted, confided in, fantasized about building a life with, had never told him she was transgender. And for Terrance, that wasn't just a lie. It was betrayal. It was humiliation. It was rage. The next visit came 2 days later. He didn't cancel it. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He just stared at Nina across the table, hollow-eyed, cold, and still, she could tell something was wrong. Her hands trembled as she reached out. "Terrance, what's going on?" He leaned forward, his voice calm, measured, deadly. "You lied to me." She went pale. "I know who you are. I know who you were." Nina's lips parted, but no words came. Tears formed in her eyes. "I was going to tell you. I just didn't know how. I was afraid you'd hate me. You should have told me before you became my wife." Her voice cracked. "I loved you. I still do." He didn't respond, didn't move. Inside him, a storm had begun. It wasn't just about Nina. It was about every lie he'd ever been told. Every time someone used him, abandoned him, played him for a fool. And in his eyes, this was the worst betrayal of all. He stood slowly as the visitation ended, and before the guards could escort him out, he turned back one last time. Something in him had shifted, and whatever came next wouldn't be love. It would be blood. June 17th was scorching hot, the kind of heat that melted through concrete and wrapped the prison yard in a suffocating haze. Inside South Ridge Correctional Facility, fans buzzed uselessly above sweat-drenched inmates, and the guards moved slower, lazier, irritated by the temperature and the routine monotony of their shift. But for Terrance Whitaker, the heat wasn't the problem. His skin was already on fire from the inside out. He had barely slept the night before. His hands trembled despite his stillness. The moment he opened his eyes that morning, he knew what day it was. Visitation day. Nina had scheduled the appointment a week ago. She hadn't missed a visit in months, not even after he confronted her. Her last letter, written in shaky cursive and stained with tears, begged him to talk to her in person. "Please just look me in the eyes one more time," she wrote. "Let me explain." He had no plans to listen. Terrance hadn't spoken to anyone in 3 days. He barely ate. He didn't exercise. He sat, hands folded, eyes locked on the wall. His cellmate didn't say a word to him. The guards noticed a shift in his demeanor, still composed, but hollow, like someone waiting for a storm only he could see. At 1:37 p.m., his name was called. Inmate Whitaker. You got a visitor. He rose without a word. His steps were slow but deliberate, each footfall echoing like a countdown. Through the long corridor, past steel bars and hollow glances, he walked toward the visitation room with something dangerous hiding behind his eyes. Not rage, not grief, but cold, bone-deep decision. Inside the visitation room, the air conditioning barely worked. A few fans oscillated weakly near the corners, failing to disperse the thick tension that seemed to hang in the room like smoke. A few other inmates were already seated with their visitors. Parents, girlfriends, children, all engaged in quiet conversation. And then she entered, Nina, wearing a pale blue summer dress that clung to her in the heat. Her hair was tied up, face flushed from the sun, and her eyes, those wide, brown eyes he used to find comfort in, now shimmered with uncertainty. She clutched her visitor's past like a lifeline. When she saw him sitting there, stone-faced and still, her steps slowed. He didn't stand to greet her, didn't smile, didn't blink. She approached the table and sat down, folding her hands carefully in front of her, unsure whether to reach for his. "Hi," she whispered. He said nothing. I know you're angry. I deserve that," she began, her voice trembling. "But I swear to you, Terrance, I never meant to hurt you. I never lied to trick you. I was afraid. I thought if I told you, you'd never even give me a chance." He tilted his head slightly, eyes locked on her. "You let me fall in love with someone who didn't exist," he said flatly. "I do exist," she whispered. "This is who I am. I'm Nina. I've always been Nina." "You're Marcus," he snapped, voice like steel. "Marcus D. Lovell. That's what it says on your record. That's what you were born." She flinched. "I'm not that person anymore. But you marry me under a lie. You let me believe things about us, about the future, about you. I dreamed about having kids with you." Her lip quivered. "We could have adopted." "Shut the hell up," he said, quietly but sharply. The tables around them grew quiet. A few guards glanced over. One of them, Officer Landry, began slowly walking in their direction, just in case. "I gave you everything I had left," Terrance whispered. "I let you into my spirit. I loved you." "And I loved you," Nina said, reaching across the table, her voice breaking. "I still do. I just didn't know how to tell you. I thought if I waited, if I showed you the real me, maybe it wouldn't matter." His jaw clenched. It mattered. Silence. A long, cold silence. She withdrew her hand. Tears streamed down her face. But he didn't care. Not anymore. Then, slowly, Terrance reached under the table. No one noticed at first. Not the inmates, not the visitors, not even Officer Landry. What he pulled out was small. Homemade. A shiv. A weapon carved from a melted-down toothbrush and a sharpened piece of metal hidden in his waistband. In one swift motion, he lunged forward and stabbed Nina in the throat. The room erupted into chaos. Blood spurted across the table as she fell back, gasping, clutching her neck. A wet, gargling sound escaped her lips as her eyes stretched wide with shock and terror. Screams pierced the room. Chairs scraped. Guards rushed. But Terrance wasn't finished. He vaulted across the table and plunged the blade into her chest. Again, and again, and again. By the time officers tackled him to the ground, Nina was slumped on the floor, a crimson pool spreading beneath her body, her dress soaked in blood, her hand still reaching out toward him, twitching slightly. One final breath, and then stillness. Guards dragged Terrance back, arms pinned, face streaked with sweat and rage. He didn't fight them. He didn't scream. He just stared at her lifeless body as they hauled him away, his voice calm, almost eerie. "She lied to me." Those were his last words before they slammed the door behind him. Outside the visitation room, sirens wailed. Paramedics arrived too late. The warden called for a facility-wide lockdown. Every visitor was escorted out. Every inmate strip-searched. Officers barked orders. But no one was really listening. Word traveled fast. By the time the news hit the outside world, the headline had already gone viral. Inmate kills transgender wife during visitation. Claimed he was deceived. But inside Southridge, where the walls remembered everything, there was no need for headlines. Everyone had seen it. Some said they saw it coming. Others said it was murder, plain and simple. A few muttered things under their breath, words too ugly to repeat. But no one forgot what they saw. Terrance Whitaker, the man who once found peace in letters written on lavender paper, had transformed before their eyes. The love that had saved him had become the reason he killed. And on that hot June afternoon, the visiting room at Southridge became a crime scene soaked in heartbreak, betrayal, and blood. The blood was gone from the floor by morning, but the stain remained in the air, thick, metallic, invisible, unforgettable. Inside Southridge Correctional Facility, time seemed to stop. Everything moved in slow motion the day after murder. Inmates whispered in their cells. The usual noise of slamming dominoes and shouted jokes replaced by an eerie quiet. The guards barked louder than usual, maybe because they were angry, maybe because they were scared. Every corner of the prison felt tight. Suspicion hovered like smoke. Terrance Whitaker had been transferred overnight to solitary confinement. A cold, concrete box where no light touched the floor, no sound made it through the walls, and no human voice softened the silence. He'd been stripped, hosed down, and locked up under 24-hour surveillance, not for his safety, but for the system's. Because outside the prison walls, the storm was already brewing. The media exploded. Local news stations ran the story on repeat. Grainy footage of ambulances outside the prison, guards standing grim-faced behind crime scene tape, photos of Nina, smiling unsuspecting, paired with mugshots of Terrance, stone-faced, unreadable. The headlines were ruthless. Brutal murder inside visitation room. Inmate claims wife lied about being a man. Transgender woman slain by inmate husband. Hate crime or betrayal? Southridge horror. Love, lies, and murder. In the days that followed, protesters gathered outside the facility gates. Some held signs that read "Justice for Nina." Others screamed about deception and manipulation. The nation was split down the center. One half saw Terrance as a violent bigot. The other painted him as a victim of deceit. But nobody could ignore the weight of what had happened. Because Nina wasn't just a name in a headline. Her story was complicated. Her identity, courageous. Her past, filled with years of struggle and pain. According to the coroner's report, she'd undergone full transition 5 years prior. She had legally changed her name, lived as a woman, and left her old self behind with intention and permanence. Her friends describe her as soft-spoken, artistic, and full of empathy. Her landlord said she paid rent early. Her co-workers said she was a quiet genius with color palettes and branding. No one, not a single person, believed she was capable of malicious intent. But none of those voices made it inside Terrance's cell. He sat alone in the dark, staring at the small bar window above him. No sunlight reached his face. His hands were still stained red beneath his nails. His heart was still pounding with that same dangerous rhythm, not from adrenaline, not from regret, but from the emptiness that followed the violence. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't speak to the guards. He just sat, quiet, unmoving. In the prison yard, Nina's name became a whisper people only dared say when no one was listening. Some inmates said she got what she deserved. Others said Terrance had snapped because he couldn't face himself, because she loved him too deeply, and that terrified him. A few didn't say anything at all. And outside the prison gates, Nina's mother arrived. Her name was Evelyn Lovell, a retired nurse in her late 50s with tired eyes and trembling hands. She hadn't spoken to her child in nearly 2 years. Not since their final phone call ended in tears, arguments, and a painful silence that neither had been brave enough to break. But now Evelyn stood at the prison entrance, clutching a framed photo of Nina at age 7, missing her front teeth, her smile bright and innocent. Reporters swarmed her. Cameras flashed. But she didn't flinch. She looked into the lens and said, with a voice hoarse from grief, "My child didn't deserve to die like that. No one does. I wasn't perfect. I made mistakes." But she was trying to live her truth, and he took that from her. Her words echoed across television screens and social feeds, igniting fire on both sides of the national debate. Inside courtrooms and newsrooms, the legal process kicked into motion. Terrance was charged with first-degree murder, use of a deadly weapon, and aggravated assault. Prosecutors labeled it a hate crime, citing premeditation, a homemade weapon, and his motive. But Terrance's defense would argue that he had been emotionally deceived, that the killing wasn't about gender, but about trust, about betrayal so deep it cracked something inside him. The question wasn't did he kill her. That was indisputable. The question was why, and whether that why changed the meaning of what he did. Back in Southridge, inmates debated the story like religion. Some called Nina a trap, others called Terrance a monster. But every man who ever knew what it felt like to be forgotten, to be left behind by the world, knew one truth. Terrance had something rare, something beautiful, and he destroyed it. He murdered the one person who still believed he could be better. In the weeks after Nina's death, letters poured into the prison, some addressed to Terrance, filled with hate, others addressed to the warden, begging for answers. A few addressed to no one in particular, just words typed on trembling hands by members of the trans community, people who saw themselves in Nina, people who now felt more afraid, more exposed, more hunted. The Department of Corrections issued a brief statement. We are investigating how a weapon was brought into the visitation area and reviewing security protocols. But everyone knew the truth. That shiv came from inside. It always does. Because prisons don't just cage bodies. They breed silence. And in that silence, a man who once smiled at the scent of lavender ink had carved a weapon out of nothing and murdered the only softness he'd ever known. The guard stopped talking about it. After a while, the news moved on. Another tragedy, another day, but the men in South Ridge remembered. So did Evelyn Lovell. So did everyone who saw the blood. And Terrance? He stopped writing, stopped eating. He spent hours each day pacing the length of his cell, for steps one way, for steps back, like a man waiting for judgment from a God who no longer spoke his name. Because after the rage, after the storm, after the murder, all that remained was silence. And silence doesn't forgive. The trial of Terrance Whitaker began on a cold Monday morning in late October. By then, the blood had dried, the protests had quieted, and Nina's name had faded from daily headlines. But in that Georgia courtroom, her presence loomed large. Her face, projected on a monitor at the front of the room, smiled eternally in a photo taken just weeks before her murder. Blue dress, soft curls, warm, unassuming eyes. She had walked into a prison visitation room, looking for love. She left in a body bag. Terrance entered the courtroom in shackles, his orange jumpsuit crisp, his face unreadable. He didn't look at the gallery, didn't glance at Nina's mother, who sat in the front row clutching a rosary she hadn't touched in years. The press crowded the aisles. Activists filled the benches. Members of the transgender community watched with folded arms and heavy hearts. The nation waited. The People versus Terrance Whitaker wasn't just a murder trial. It was a referendum on identity, masculinity, truth, and the fatal collision of love and shame. The prosecution opened with a single sentence that echoed like a gunshot. She loved him, and he killed her for it. They painted a picture of premeditation, a homemade weapon, a calculated attack, a cold-blooded execution carried out in broad daylight. They reminded the jury that Nina posed no threat, had committed no crime, and had sat across from her husband with love in her eyes and peace in her heart. They showed the blood-soaked dress, the autopsy photos, the final letter she wrote unopened, found in Terrance's cell. The defense countered with a different story. They didn't deny the killing. Instead, they leaned into the emotional storm that preceded it. They called it a psychological break, a man betrayed, deceived, emotionally violated. They used terms like trauma, identity collapse, and irreversible shock. They brought in prison psychologists to testify that Terrance had grown up in an environment where trust was currency and betrayal was deadly. They said he was a man conditioned to survive, not to feel, and that when the one person he allowed himself to love revealed a truth he didn't understand or expect, it shattered him. The courtroom split. Some jurors sat stone-faced. Others wept. Evelyn Lovell, Nina's mother, never looked away. She testified on the third day. Her voice didn't tremble. Her grief had calcified into clarity. She recounted the pain of losing a child, yes, but also the pain of losing Nina twice. Once when she transitioned, and again when she died. "I failed her once," she said, looking at the jury. "I didn't stand by her when she needed me. But don't you let this world fail her again." Her words hung in the room like scripture. In the end, it came down to two truths, both bleeding and raw. Terrance had been betrayed, at least in his eyes, and Nina had been murdered. After 7 days of testimony, 12 hours of deliberation, and a courtroom stretched thin with tension, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty on all counts. First-degree murder, aggravated assault, possession of a deadly weapon, and most notably, hate crime enhancement. As the judge read the sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole, Terrance didn't flinch. He simply closed his eyes, as if he had known deep down that this would be the price, not just for the killing, but for everything. After the sentencing, Evelyn stepped out onto the courthouse steps. Reporters gathered around her like moths to flame, but she didn't yell. She didn't curse. She simply held up a framed photo of Nina, tears shining in her eyes, and said, "She was never a secret. She was my daughter. She was real, and she deserved to live." That image would circulate for months. Legacy. In the aftermath of the verdict, Nina's story became more than a tragedy. It became a symbol. For some, a cautionary tale about secrets, deception, and emotional violence. For others, a brutal reminder of how dangerous it can be simply to live as who you are. The LGBTQ+ community rallied behind her name. Her story sparked renewed conversations about trans visibility, prison visitation rights, and hate crime protections for transgender individuals. A foundation was created in her memory, the Nina Lovell Project, aimed at providing support, therapy, and emergency housing for trans women facing violence and homelessness. Her art, once hidden in sketchbooks she mailed to Terrance, was displayed in a small gallery in Savannah. Pastel landscapes, portraits of women in quiet poses, eyes that seemed to say everything she never could. People lined up for hours to see them. And in the prison where it all began, inmates still talk about her. Not loudly, not with cruelty, but with a kind of uneasy awe, because they all saw what Terrance had, and what he destroyed. As for Terrance Whitaker, he remains in solitary confinement, not for punishment, but for protection. He has become both pariah and martyr. A man who loved, then broke. Some letters arrive for him. Others go unanswered. No visitors. No interviews. Just silence. Some say he talks to her in the dark, that he whispers her name in the hours before dawn, that the only voice he hears anymore is the one he silenced. And maybe in some cruel twist of fate, that's justice too. Because in the end, the tragedy wasn't just that Nina died. It was that love, real, flawed, human love, walked into that prison, tried to bloom through concrete and wire, and was met not with grace, but with a blade. And now, both of them live in memory. One, beneath a marble headstone etched with lilies and her chosen name. The other, behind steel doors, serving a life sentence of silence.